The skies were dark, not with storm but with silence. Jerusalem had fallen. The sacred city, once a beacon of faith and glory, now wept under the ashes of conquest. Her people were torn from their homes, marched in chains across burning sands to foreign lands. The temple lay desecrated. The voices of prophets had faded. The chosen had become captives. And in the midst of this despair, a voice rose again. Not from a palace. Not from a temple. But from the banks of a river in a strange land. A man stood there, cloaked not in royal linen, but in vision Ezekiel, son of Buzi, priest of the exiles, chosen of the Most High. He did not come with sword or shield. He came with fire in his eyes and thunder in his soul. And when he spoke, heaven opened. Ezekiel's story is not like the others. It is not soft or easy. It is not filled with victories in battle or peaceful journeys through the wilderness. No, his tale is forged in exile, whispered in nightmares, shouted through visions that shattered reality itself. He saw wheels within wheels, creatures of light and fire, bones that rose from the dust and stood again. He watched the glory of the Lord depart from the temple. He heard God speak not from the mountaintop, but from the skyless lands of Babylon. Ezekiel was a prophet for the broken. A prophet for the displaced. A prophet whose calling was born not in triumph, but in collapse. He lived among a people who had forgotten the covenant and were now living the consequence. A people stripped of their identity, asking in bitterness, "Has our God forgotten us?" And Ezekiel's answer was both terrifying and tender, "No, he has not forgotten. But he is no longer confined to walls of stone. He moves among you even here. Even in exile." His voice was thunder to the rebellious, but balm to the repentant. His visions terrified kings and priests alike. Yet in all their mystery and might, his prophecies held one unshakable promise: restoration. That even in judgment, there is mercy. That even in ruin, there is hope. The name Ezekiel means God strengthens. And true to his name, he stood like a fortress in a land without sanctuary. He saw what others feared to see. He spoke what others dared not utter. And he became the bridge between a shattered past and a promised future. This is not a tale of comfort. It is a tale of reckoning. A tale of wheels that spin beyond human sight, of a valley where death breathes again, of a God who leaves his house but not his people. This is the story of Ezekiel. And it begins not in Jerusalem, but in exile. Where heaven opens once more. Birth and early life. Before the wheels of heaven turned before his eyes, before the exile and the visions, there was a boy. Born into the sacred line of Levi, Ezekiel, son of Buzi, opened his eyes in the holy city of Jerusalem, a city glowing with memory, filled with priests, sacrifice, and the thick incense of worship rising toward the heavens. His birth was not surrounded by kings or marvels, but by sacred silence, the hush of destiny weaving threads through an infant not yet aware of his purpose. His father, Buzi, was a priest of the temple, a man of the holy inner courts, a servant of the law, one who walked in the rhythm of tradition and purity. From him, Ezekiel inherited not only the priesthood by blood, but also a fire quiet at first, hidden behind calm eyes, but destined to blaze into prophecy. He was raised among scrolls and rituals, in the shadow of the temple's mighty walls. As a child, he learned the law by heart, not as words carved in stone, but as living commandments flowing from the voice of the Almighty. Every morning, the sound of ram's horns stirred the air, every evening the flames of sacrifice flickered in the twilight. This was the rhythm of his youth, holy, precise, majestic. But even as he studied, even as he memorized the sacred ordinances, a weight lingered upon him. Others may have spoken of God with tradition. But Ezekiel, young, silent, watchful, felt him. He would sit beneath the great cedars that ringed the hills and stare at the sky as if searching for movement in the clouds. He listened for a whisper no one else could hear. He observed the priests as they moved through their duties, his heart torn between reverence and restlessness. Something stirred within him, a knowledge that the presence of the Most High was deeper than ceremony, wider than stone walls. He was marked early by solitude. Not out of pride or rebellion but by intensity. He asked questions others avoided. He wept at injustices others ignored. He fasted when he should have played. Some said he was strange, others said he was touched. But his father knew better. Buza saw it. This child would not serve as other priests did. He would not merely burn incense or chant prayers. He was born for something beyond the temple's veil. And time confirmed the signs. As he entered manhood, the city around him darkened. Corruption crept into holy places. The kings turned to idols. The prophets were silenced or killed. And all the while, Ezekiel watched. He did not speak publicly. Not yet. But inside him, the voice of God was beginning to stir, not gently, but like thunder hidden behind mountains. Then came the year of his 25th. The year everything changed. Jerusalem trembled. The Babylonians came. The first wave of exile began. And Ezekiel, still a priest, still young, was taken not as a captive alone, but as a chosen vessel removed from the holy city, to be shaped in foreign soil. But the fire within him would not be extinguished by distance. The priest would become a prophet. And the voice he had heard faintly as a boy, would soon roar like a storm. World at that time. The world into which Ezekiel was born stood on a knife's edge, its kingdom swollen with pride, its thrones dripping with blood, and its temples polluted by idols carved from fear and greed. The sacred land of Judah, once the heart of divine covenant, had become a place of divided loyalties. Though the Temple of Solomon still stood in Jerusalem, glowing in gold and filled with ritual, the soul of the nation had begun to rot. Kings no longer trembled before the law, they bartered with it. Priests no longer wept for the people, they schemed among them. Prophets who dared to speak the truth were hunted, mocked, or silenced. The cries of the poor rose like incense, but there was no justice. The foreign gods of stone and fire sat beside the God of Abraham in secret shrines and open markets. Judah had not only wandered, it had defied. And outside her walls, something darker stirred. To the north, a storm was rising, the Babylonian Empire, vast and cruel, with iron teeth and golden pride. Once allies, now masters, the Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar II had set their eyes on total domination. They had already swallowed Assyria, had crushed Egypt's pride at Carchemish, and now hovered over Jerusalem like a vulture circling a wounded lamb. The year was near 597 BCE when it began in earnest. Nebuchadnezzar struck Jerusalem not in total ruin, but with warning. The temple was spared, but the king was humbled. Jehoiakim, ruler of Judah, was taken captive, along with 10,000 others, the nobles, the skilled, the learned, and among them Ezekiel. It was not only a political exile, it was a divine response. The covenant had been abandoned. The nation had traded holiness for vanity. And so, the Most High allowed his people to be carried into a land of idols. In Babylon, the exiles wept beside rivers they did not know, Chebar, Euphrates, and others. The songs of Zion were silenced. The instruments of praise hung unused. A generation that had called itself chosen now wandered in the shadow of foreign gods, asking, "Why has the Lord abandoned us?" But Babylon was not the only beast rising. Egypt, to the south, still seated with ambition, whispering rebellion into Judah's ears, urging her to throw off Babylonian rule. The land was caught in the jaws of two titans, and Judah, deceived by false prophets, began to dream of resistance. Yet in heaven, a different story was being written. God was not blind. His silence was not neglect. His exile was not abandonment. It was purification. A final cry before judgment would fall in full. Into this broken world, this world of betrayal, invasion, idolatry, and fear, Ezekiel was sent not just as a voice, but as a vessel. He had seen the splendor of Jerusalem. Now he would witness her fall. He had breathed incense in the holy place. Now he would breathe the dust of exile. And yet, in the heart of Babylon, by the river Chebar, the heavens would open not to kings or warriors, but to a broken priest-made prophet. The world was falling apart. But the voice of God was about to speak again. Signs of prophethood. There were whispers among the exiles, whispers that one among them had changed. It was not something he said, at first. It was something in his eyes. Ezekiel, son of Buzi, once a quiet priest trained in sacred rites, now walked as though he carried something unseen. He stared at the sky for hours. He would sit near the river Chebar with his hands trembling, not from age, but from awe. Those around him began to speak softly in his presence, unsure of what lingered within him. They didn't know what had happened. But Ezekiel did. The signs had come sudden, terrifying, undeniable. It began in the 5th year of exile, when Ezekiel was 30, the age at which a priest was permitted to serve in the temple. But he was far from Jerusalem. There were no altars, no incense, no sacred vessels. And yet, the heavens opened. As he sat among the captives by the river, a vision tore through the veil of the sky. A storm approached, not of wind and sand, but of fire and lightning, surrounded by a great cloud. From within that cloud, forms emerged unlike anything known to man, living creatures, each with 4 faces: human, lion, ox, an eagle, and 4 wings that shimmered like polished bronze. And beneath these beings, wheels. Not ordinary wheels, but wheels within wheels, spinning in every direction, their rims full of eyes, all seeing, all moving, never turning. Wherever the creatures went, the wheels followed. And above them, a throne. And on that throne a figure like a man, glowing like fire, encircled in brilliant light. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord, Ezekiel would later write. And when I saw it, I fell upon my face. He was not dreaming. He was witnessing. And this vision would mark the beginning of everything. But the signs did not end with visions alone. Ezekiel's body became a sign. His actions became parables. He was commanded to lie on his side for hundreds of days, to shave his head and beard with a sword, to cook food over dung, to build a model of Jerusalem and lay siege to it in miniature. These were not the acts of madness, they were the divine theater of prophecy. And the people watched, some in horror, some in mockery, but none could look away. Even his personal life bore the mark of his calling. When his beloved wife died, he was forbidden to mourn her publicly. Sigh in silence, the Lord said, for I will take away the delight of your eyes. His grief was turned into prophecy. His sorrow mirrored what the people would feel when the temple itself, the delight of the nation, was destroyed. The signs were not for spectacle. They were warnings. Ezekiel was becoming more than a priest. His soul was now the canvas on which God would paint his fury and mercy. His body, his home, his voice, all were instruments in the hands of the Most High. The people began to fear him not because he threatened them, but because when he looked into the distance, it felt as though he saw beyond time. The fire of heaven had touched him. The voice that had once spoken from Sinai now spoke through him, and Babylon was no longer silent. Call to prophethood. The heavens opened not with whispers, but with thunder. And in the 5th year of exile, by the shimmering waters of the river Chebar, the veil between the eternal and the temporal was torn apart. It was there that the priest, Ezekiel, knelt in awe and terror as a vision unlike any ever seen by man unfolded before his trembling eyes. A storm approached, great and terrible, not of wind or rain, but of fire and radiance. A mighty cloud rolled forward, pulsing with lightning, glowing from within. The sky cracked open, and from that brilliance emerged the unimaginable, 4 living creatures. They shimmered like burning bronze, each with 4 wings and 4 faces: the face of a man, the face of a lion, the face of an ox, and the face of an eagle. Their wings touched one another, and beneath them stood wheels within wheels, spinning with a fury that defied human reason, their rims covered with eyes, watchful and divine. Above this swirling chariot of fire and spirit, a throne of sapphire-like glory appeared. And upon it sat a figure like a man, blazing with light, surrounded by a brilliance that looked like a rainbow in the storm. This was no metaphor. This was the glory of the Lord. And Ezekiel fell on his face. This was the moment everything changed. As he lay prostrate, the voice came not in thunder, but in solemn majesty. Son of man, stand upon your feet, and I will speak with you. At that moment, a spirit entered him, not a feeling or a thought, but a power. It lifted him, not by strength of limb, but by the will of the divine. Ezekiel stood, not of his own will, but by command. He was no longer merely a priest. He was now a chosen vessel of prophecy. The voice continued, direct, holy, filled with both sorrow and fire. I am sending you to the children of Israel, to a rebellious nation that has rebelled against me. They are impudent and hard-hearted. But you shall speak my words to them, whether they hear or whether they refuse. It was not a mission of comfort. It was not a mission of applause. It was a summons to stand as a mirror before a stubborn people, to show them not what they wanted to see, but what they had become. The Lord gave him a scroll written on both sides, filled with lamentations, mourning, and woe. He said, Son of man, eat this scroll, and go, speak to the house of Israel. Ezekiel took it in his hands. It was bitter to the touch, yet sweet in his mouth. It entered his being like fire, and his heart burned with the weight of the message. From that day, he was no longer his own. The call was not only divine, it was miraculous. Ezekiel did not merely hear the voice of God, he embodied it. He became a walking prophecy. God placed upon him signs that defied nature. He was made to lie on his left side for 390 days to symbolize the years of Israel's sin, and on his right side for 40 more to mark Judah's iniquity. He was made mute, his mouth sealed until the word of the Lord came to him. He could speak only when commanded. His very silence became a message, that divine revelation could no longer be taken for granted. The people watched him with fear and wonder. They mocked. They whispered. But when he spoke, when the silence broke, they could not turn away. God gave him visions beyond imagination. He saw the temple filled with secret idols and creeping abominations. He was carried in the spirit to Jerusalem, where he witnessed the elders of Israel bowing to the sun within the sacred courts. He saw the glory of the Lord depart from the temple, rising from the cherubim and moving out through the eastern gate. It was not destruction alone, it was heartbreak. The presence that once filled Solomon's sanctuary was leaving its people. But even in judgment, there was mercy. In the midst of wrath, Ezekiel saw the remnant, a marked few who wept for the abominations around them. They would be spared. God would not destroy the soul of the nation, only its idols. And in the valley of vision, the Lord took Ezekiel further still. He brought him to a plain littered with dry bones, scattered and lifeless. And he asked, "Son of man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel answered with trembling humility, "O Lord God, you know." Then came the command, "Prophesy to these bones, and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord." And as he spoke, the bones rattled. They came together, bone to bone. Flesh grew over them, and breath entered them. An entire army rose from the dust. This was more than a vision, it was a miracle of resurrection. God was showing Ezekiel that though the nation lay broken, scattered like bones in exile, it was not beyond hope. The breath of the Almighty could raise them again. Ezekiel was now a prophet not only of warning, but of promise. A watchman, a mirror, a judge, a healer. He had seen the fire of God. He had walked in visions. He had eaten the word. He had borne the burden of divine sorrow. And from that moment on, his every breath was not his own, it belonged to the Most High. His call was not a single moment, it was a lifetime of obedience. And Babylon, for all its towers and power, would never understand the fire that walked among them, a man who had seen the glory of God, and lived to speak of it. Message and teaching. The message of Ezekiel did not echo with empty words or vague warnings. It struck with clarity and thunder, sharpened by sorrow and seared in the fire of divine truth. His voice was not meant to please the ear, it was meant to awaken the soul. At the center of his teaching stood one overwhelming truth: God is holy and his people had forgotten that. Ezekiel was sent to a people who once knew covenant, who once heard the voice of the Almighty thunder from Mount Sinai, but who now knelt before idols carved by their own hands. They still offered sacrifices, still recited prayers, but their hearts had grown cold, their justice was sold for silver. Their priests betrayed the law. Their kings chased foreign alliances instead of divine obedience. So Ezekiel's message came in layers: judgment first, then mercy. He taught that sin has a price, not just in the afterlife, but here, now. The destruction of Jerusalem was not simply a tragedy of war, it was the divine consequence of long neglected warnings. Ezekiel stood as the voice of accountability. No longer could the people blame their ancestors for their ruin. In one of his most famous teachings, he declared, "The soul who sins shall die. The son shall not bear the guilt of the father. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself." Ezekiel 18:20. With this, Ezekiel shattered the illusion of inherited guilt and called each soul into direct accountability before God. It was a radical declaration: every individual must answer for their own choices. Yet his words did not end in judgment. From the ashes, Ezekiel revealed a God who longs to heal. Again and again, the Lord speaks through him, "I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that they turn from their ways and live." Ezekiel 33:11. His message was also deeply spiritual. He foresaw a time when outward rituals would no longer be enough. The people needed more than rules, they needed rebirth. Ezekiel prophesied, "I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you. I will take the heart of stone out of your flesh and give you a heart of flesh." Ezekiel 36:26. He spoke of a time when God's Spirit would dwell not just in temples but in men and women, reshaping them from the inside out. Ezekiel also taught about leadership, about shepherds who feed themselves while the sheep suffer. He condemned false prophets, corrupt rulers, and self-serving priests. In their place, he foretold a day when God himself would shepherd his people, guiding them with justice and compassion. And in a vision that looked far beyond his time, Ezekiel spoke of a restored temple, of rivers flowing from its altar, of healing waters touching the nations, of unity where division once reigned. Through every word and symbol, Ezekiel's message remained clear: God has not forsaken his people. But he will not share his glory with idols. He will tear down in order to rebuild. He will judge in order to restore. And he will once again breathe life into dry bones. Challenges and opposition. From the moment the heavens opened above the river Chebar and the Spirit of the Lord entered him, Ezekiel stepped into a fire that would never leave his soul. But this fire, holy and all-consuming, would not burn him alone. It would sear through his relationships, his community, and his very identity. For though he was called of God, he was sent to the unwilling. Ezekiel's first and greatest challenge was not with kings or empires, it was with his own people. The exiles of Judah, now captive in the land of Babylon, did not receive him as a prophet. They remembered him as a priest, a man of tradition, one who once moved in sacred silence within the temple courts. But now, he spoke of visions no one had seen, of wheels within wheels, of judgment, and wrath and restoration. They listened but not with their hearts. They called him strange. They whispered behind his back. He speaks in riddles. His words are like parables. What does it mean to lie on his side for a year? Why does he cook over dung? What does he prove by shaving his head with a sword? They watched him but more as a curiosity than as a messenger of the Most High. Even the elders, the leaders of the exilic community, sat before him not to submit to the word, but to debate it. They questioned his authority. They tested his patience. They believed that because they still carried fragments of their culture, they still carried the favor of God. But Ezekiel saw deeper. He saw the idols of the heart, the secret sins, the hidden loyalties. And when he spoke against them, the people turned colder. His life became a sign, but his suffering became the sermon. When his wife, the delight of his eyes, was taken from him by God's decree, and he was told not to mourn, not even to weep, the people looked on in silence. They could not comprehend such obedience. But it was this pain, raw and incomprehensible, that pierced through their indifference. Then there were the false prophets, those who claimed to speak for God while soothing the rebellion of the people. They declared peace when there was none. They promised deliverance when God had spoken destruction. They mocked Ezekiel's warnings, accused him of fear-mongering, and twisted his words. Ezekiel stood alone. He bore the heavy mantle of prophecy without applause. There was no army behind him. No priestly court to protect him. He was surrounded by mockers, skeptics, and the spiritually deaf. And yet, he did not break. Because Ezekiel knew the one who had called him. He knew that the same voice which had spoken from within the storm, which had filled him with the Spirit, would also vindicate him. He knew that though the people refused to listen now, a day would come when Jerusalem would fall, the temple would be destroyed, and every word he had spoken would stand as truth written in fire. His greatest challenge was not the resistance of Babylon or the hardness of Judah. His greatest challenge was to remain faithful when no one believed. To prophesy to deaf ears. To act out visions in the streets while being called mad. To suffer for a message that few wanted, and fewer obeyed. But still he spoke. Still he wept. Still he burned with the word of the Lord. Because Ezekiel was not a prophet of popularity, he was a prophet of conviction. And through every challenge, every insult, every sigh of the Spirit, he never turned away. Legacy and impact. Long after the fire faded from the skies over Babylon, long after the exiles grew old in foreign lands, the name Ezekiel still carried thunder. He had not led armies. He had not rebuilt walls. He had not stood before kings like Moses or called down fire like Elijah. And yet, his voice, once dismissed in the camps by the river Chebar, would become a spiritual earthquake whose tremors never stopped. Ezekiel's legacy began in obscurity, but it grew with every fall of stone in Jerusalem. When the temple was finally destroyed, just as he had foretold, the exiles remembered. Every act they once mocked, every vision they once dismissed, returned with terrible clarity. His words had been true. They now listened. And they wrote. His scroll, rich with symbol and vision, became one of the most mysterious and awe-inspiring texts of all time. Within its chapters were scenes so otherworldly they left even scholars trembling, wheels within wheels, creatures of fire, bones rising from dust, rivers flowing from holy mountains. These were not metaphors alone, they were blueprints of divine revelation, layered with meaning for every generation to come. His prophecy of the Valley of Dry Bones became a beacon of hope not only for the exiles of Judah, but for all crushed under the weight of despair. His message reached beyond Babylon, beyond the sands of time, and into the hearts of those who had lost everything. To the weary and broken, he proclaimed, "You shall live again." His visions shaped theology in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, each drawing from his revelations. Jewish mystics saw in Ezekiel the chariot of divine glory, the Merkava, a path into the mysteries of God's throne. Christian thinkers saw foreshadows of Christ, of resurrection, of the Spirit breathing life into the dead. In Islam, Ezekiel's patience, visions, and words were honored among the righteous, his story preserved by those who revered all prophets without distinction. Even in secular memory, Ezekiel's impact endured. Artists painted his visions. Poets echoed his voice. Theologians wept over his scrolls. His image stood not as a man of comfort but as a sentinel of truth. But his greatest legacy was not what he saw, it was what he never stopped believing, that no fall is final. That God may break, but only to rebuild stronger. That exile is not abandonment but correction. That dry bones, no matter how lifeless, can still rise when God breathes. Ezekiel did not live to see the temple rebuilt. He did not return to Jerusalem. He died in Babylon, a stranger in a strange land. But his visions traveled further than any exile could dream. His message outlived empires. And his name became a symbol not of conquest, but of restoration. He was the prophet of wheels and fire, of warning and mercy, of silence and storm. He walked where few dared to walk, into the heart of divine glory, and returned not to boast, but to call the fallen back to holiness. Ezekiel's legacy is this: he showed us the God who judges, and then restores. Death and burial. The river still flowed. The wind still whispered across the plains of Babylon. And somewhere near the water's edge, the prophet's voice fell silent, not because his message ended, but because his mission had been fulfilled. Ezekiel did not die in war. He was not martyred by sword or flame. His passing, like much of his life, was wrapped in mystery and reverence. And though the scriptures offer no vivid record of his final breath, the echoes of his life suggest a departure marked not by sorrow, but by majesty. He had spent decades among the exiles, preaching, weeping, warning, prophesying. His body bore the signs of divine obedience. His soul had carried visions that few on earth ever dared to imagine. He had seen the glory of God rise from the temple and return again in promise. And when the time came for him to leave this world, he did so not as a captive, but as a crowned servant of the Most High. Traditions preserved among the Jewish sages and Islamic narrations speak of his final days as ones of peace and spiritual strength. Even among the Babylonians, he had earned a reputation of wisdom and fearsome insight. Though many of his generation had perished in bitterness, Ezekiel remained a pillar for the faithful, a living reminder that even in exile, God speaks. As he grew old, his words turned less to judgment and more to restoration. His final teachings were not thunder, but stillness. He spoke of rivers flowing from the future temple, of healing trees, of unity, of God dwelling again among his people. These were not the cries of a man fading into death, they were the final notes of a life lived as a bridge between heaven and earth. According to multiple traditions, especially in Islamic heritage, Ezekiel was buried in Al-Kifl, a town in present-day Iraq, near the Euphrates River. His tomb, still revered today, lies in a structure that has drawn Jews, Muslims, and Christians for centuries. They come not for relics or superstition but to honor the voice that thundered in exile, that brought fire to the dry bones, and that reminded generations, God has not forgotten. Some say that his resting place was once guarded by generations of priests and scholars. Others recount that travelers would hear prayers whispered in the wind near his tomb, verses from his visions still echoing among the stones. No monument could fully capture what Ezekiel carried. No gravestone could explain the visions he saw. And yet, in that quiet land by the river, his body rests while his words still rise like incense to the throne above. Ezekiel died far from Jerusalem. But his spirit never left it. He had seen it fall. He had warned of its destruction. But he had also seen its rebirth, its restoration, and its divine future. His death was not an end. It was a passage from the exile of Babylon to the eternal presence of the God whose glory he had once seen atop the sapphire throne. Interfaith perspective. The life and prophethood of Ezekiel, called Isl in Arabic, left an enduring imprint on the spiritual consciousness of three major faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Though each tradition approaches his story from a distinct lens, all agree on one truth: Ezekiel was a chosen vessel of divine revelation, whose visions pierced the veil between heaven and earth. Judaism, Ezekiel as the visionary of glory. In Judaism, Ezekiel is regarded as one of the greatest prophets of the Babylonian exile. His book stands as a monumental text in the Tanakh Hebrew Bible, grouped among the major prophets. To Jewish scholars, Ezekiel's visions, especially the Merkava divine chariot in chapter 1, are considered so mystical and powerful that, historically, rabbinic tradition discouraged their public teaching, fearing they could overwhelm the unprepared or be misunderstood. Jewish mystics, particularly those in the Kabbalistic tradition, see Ezekiel's vision as the cornerstone of Merkava mysticism, a deep meditative discipline centered on ascending through divine realms. His prophecy about the Valley of Dry Bones is seen as a metaphor for Israel's national and spiritual resurrection, often quoted during moments of Jewish suffering and redemption. Ezekiel's detailed blueprint of the future temple, chapters 40 to 48, also plays a key role in Jewish eschatology, symbolizing hope for the eventual restoration of Jerusalem and the return of God's glory. Christianity, Ezekiel as the forerunner of Christ and the Spirit. In Christianity, Ezekiel is viewed as a profound prefigure of Christ and the Holy Spirit's renewing work. Early church fathers found rich typology in his visions. The dry bones coming to life foreshadowed the resurrection of the dead, and the new heart and spirit promised by God in Ezekiel 36 to 37 prefigured regeneration through Christ and Pentecost. His role as a watchman for Israel is often cited in Christian teachings on spiritual vigilance and the responsibility to call out sin. The Apostle Paul and other New Testament writers echoed Ezekiel's themes of personal responsibility, internal transformation, and divine mercy. Christian eschatology, especially in Revelation, draw symbolic parallels to Ezekiel's visions. The temple, river of life, and heavenly throne described by John closely mirror Ezekiel's final chapters. Thus, Ezekiel becomes a bridge between the Old Covenant and the New, between judgment and grace. Islam, Izql, the silent prophet of patience and resurrection. In Islam, Ezekiel is known as Izql, and though not named explicitly in the Quran, his story is recognized through Islamic traditions and tafsir Quranic exegesis. He is often associated with the passage in Surah Al-Baqarah 2:243, where God revives a group of people who had died, interpreted by many scholars as referring to the Valley of Dry Bones, aligning with Ezekiel 37. Muslim scholars like Ibn Kathir, Al-Abar, and others mention him as a prophet sent to the children of Israel during the Babylonian exile. He is revered for his steadfastness, devotion, and ability to deliver divine messages under immense hardship. His teachings in Islam are centered around themes of Tawhid, the oneness of God, repentance, and spiritual revival. Islamic tradition also honors his resting place in Al-Kifl, Iraq, which remains a site of visitation for Muslims, Jews, and Christians alike. Unlike in Christianity, Ezekiel is not associated with messianic prophecy in Islam, but rather as a testament to God's power to resurrect and renew, physically and spiritually. Unified reflection. Though the details differ, Ezekiel's message in all three faiths remains a call to turn from sin, to recognize the holiness of God, and to hope in divine restoration. Whether through mystic chariots, resurrected bones, or spiritual rebirth, Ezekiel's legacy is one of unshakable faith in the midst of ruin. He is the prophet who stood in exile and pointed toward eternity. The man who saw the glory and lived to tell the world.